The attack happened without warning. 5 Navy SEAL combat dogs trained for battlefield extraction, hardened by 3 overseas deployments, turned on their own handlers inside Harbor Ridge Military Hospital's containment wing. In 90 seconds, 4 elite operators were bleeding on the floor. The 5th ran. Every trained military professional in the building retreated behind sealed blast doors, and no one had a solution. Then Lydia Carter, a civilian floor nurse in blue scrubs and rubber-soled shoes, walked past the barricade, pushed open the containment door, and stepped inside. The 5 dogs stopped. All of them, simultaneously. They turned toward her like compass needles, finding north, and every soldier watching through the reinforced glass felt something cold move through their chest that had nothing to do with fear. If you want to find out what Lydia was really hiding and what those dogs recognized in her, follow this channel. Hit like and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most mornings at Harbor Ridge started: understaffed, overpressured, and running on bad coffee. Harbor Ridge Military Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Phoenix, Arizona, where the desert met the sprawl of a city that never quite decided what it wanted to be. The facility handled active duty casualties, post-deployment rehabilitation, and in its restricted lower wing specialized programs that didn't appear in any public funding report. It was a building full of locked doors and people who'd learned not to ask questions about them. Lydia Carter had worked there for 14 months. She was 31 years old, 5'6", with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep ever fully erased. She kept her hair pulled back during shifts because she didn't have time to think about it. She ate lunch standing up. She knew every patient on her floor by name, medication schedule, and the specific way each one flinched when they thought no one was watching. She was not what anyone would call remarkable. That was precisely the point. Carter, senior charge nurse Patricia Hollis, called her name the way people call for a cab: functional, impersonal, already looking somewhere else. Pharmacy sent up the wrong dosage on bed 7 again. Handle it before rounds. Already called it in, Lydia said, without looking up from the intake form she was completing. Hollis paused. When? 20 minutes ago. They're reprocessing. It'll be here before Dr. Malone gets to that wing. She finished the form, clipped it to the board, and moved to the next task without ceremony. Hollis watched her for a second, with an expression that wasn't quite irritation and wasn't quite respect. She settled on something closer to mild suspicion and walked away. That was Lydia's life at Harbor Ridge. She solved problems before other people noticed them, received no credit for it, and didn't particularly need any. She had taken this job for reasons that had nothing to do with career ambition, and she intended to keep those reasons to herself. She was halfway through morning medication distribution when the alarm changed. Harbor Ridge had 3 alarm tones, the standard code tones that hospitals everywhere used. The security alert, a low pulsing double beep that meant a patient had become combative or a restricted area had been accessed without authorization. And then there was the one Lydia had never heard activated in 14 months, the one that came with a specific overhead announcement that made 3 nurses freeze in the middle of the hallway and stare at the ceiling speakers like they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Code Bravo, Sublevel 2. All non-essential personnel clear the sector. This is not a drill. Code Bravo. Containment failure. The restricted K9 medical unit occupied Sublevel 2, a wing that most of the hospital's civilian staff pretended didn't exist. Lydia had known it was there since her 3rd week. She'd noticed the handlers coming and going through the freight elevator. The specific antiseptic smell layered underneath the more industrial cleaning compounds used down there. The way certain military personnel tensed almost imperceptibly when someone from the regular staff got too close to the sublevel access corridor. She'd said nothing. She'd kept her distance. She'd had very specific reasons for both. She set down her medication tray, secured it in the rolling cabinet, and walked to the stairwell door. She did not run. Running attracted attention, and she didn't want attention right now. She wanted to see what was happening before anyone decided she needed to be managed away from it. The stairwell gave her a view of the main floor below before she descended 2 levels. She could already see Commander Ethan Walker. She recognized him from the facility's personnel bulletin board, though they'd never spoken, moving fast across the lobby floor with 3 military handlers flanking him. Walker was 6'2", built like someone who'd spent a career doing things that required being built like that, with close-cropped dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been set by someone who wanted to make a point. He was not panicking, but he was not walking the way someone walks when a situation is under control. She descended to sublevel 2. The corridor outside the K9 containment wing had already been partially cleared. 2 medics were working on a handler who was sitting against the wall with his forearm wrapped in a field bandage, improvised tight, applied by someone who knew what they were doing under pressure. A second handler stood 10 feet away with a laceration above his eyebrow and the expression of a man who wasn't going to admit how shaken he was. A third was speaking rapidly into a radio, his voice professionally controlled, but his free hand gripping the radio too hard. Through the reinforced glass observation window at the end of the corridor, Lydia could see the containment room. It was a large space designed for controlled medical examination of working dogs, with multiple holding stations and equipment bays along the walls. Right now it looked like a storm had moved through it. 2 equipment carts were overturned. A monitoring station had been dragged sideways, and 5 large dogs were moving through the space in a pattern that Lydia's brain immediately began cataloging, not random aggression, not play behavior, but something specific, structured. They were moving along the walls, rotating through positions, maintaining sight lines on every entry point, like they were running a sweep pattern, like they were clearing a room. Who authorized a civilian up here? Walker's voice came from directly behind her. He hadn't raised it, which somehow made it more effective. Lydia turned. Nobody. I came on my own. Then you need to leave on your own. He stepped past her toward the observation window, already dismissing her. Kowalski, get her back upstairs. What's wrong with them? Lydia asked. That's not your concern. I'm a nurse in this facility. If I'm going to be sending personnel back to my floor with injuries, it's my concern. She kept her voice even. What's wrong with the dogs? Walker turned and looked at her for the first time, really looked at her, the way military people assessed things, functional and fast. Combat stress response, he said, with the brevity of someone giving a minimum required answer. They've been cycling through a reaction pattern since 400. We had them stable. Something triggered a secondary response during the morning vitals check. Which dog triggered first? He stopped. What? When the secondary response started, which dog moved first? Walker's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalibration, quick and involuntary. The Belgian Malinois, Nero. Why? Lydia looked back through the observation window. She found Nero without difficulty. He was the most mobile, the one driving the group's pattern, the others orienting around him. He was also, she noted, favoring his left rear leg slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it. He's in pain, she said. That leg, did he have a recent procedure? A beat of silence behind her. Suture removal, 2 days ago. Soft tissue repair. It's pulling. The movement is aggravating it, and he's keying up from the discomfort, and the others are reading his distress and mirroring it. She turned back to Walker. They're not in a combat stress cycle. They're in a pain response loop that you've been treating like an aggression protocol. Every time your handlers went in there, they introduced higher stress stimuli, unfamiliar approach angles, direct eye contact, dominant body language, and escalated the dog's anxiety instead of de-escalating it. Walker stared at her. Who are you? He said. Lydia Carter. 3rd floor nursing staff. She paused. I'd like to go in. The look on his face was the one she'd expected, a complicated mixture of professional reflex, which was absolutely not, and the first faint crack of something that might have been curiosity if he'd let it go any further. You're a floor nurse. Yes, those are SEAL unit combat dogs. The smallest one is 93 pounds. I know. 2 of my handlers needed stitches. I saw. And you want to go in there? I'm not asking for permission, Lydia said, and she heard her own voice and recognized the tone in it, the one she'd spent 14 months keeping buried, and she thought, careful. I'm telling you what I think is the right call. You can override me. That's your prerogative. But whatever you've been doing for the last 6 hours isn't working, and I think I can help. Walker held her gaze for 3 full seconds. It was the look of a man running a rapid calculation between professional skepticism and operational necessity, and she waited him out because she knew which one was going to win. You go in alone, he said finally. My team stays outside. First sign of an aggressive response, we extract you. Understood. And afterward, you explain to me how a civilian floor nurse knows combat stress assessment protocols for military working dogs. Afterward, Lydia agreed. She didn't wait for him to change his mind. The containment room door had a 2-stage entry and outer code panel, then a physical bar lock that had to be manually released from inside the corridor. Walker cleared the code. One of the handlers, Kowalski, the one who'd been told to remove her, pulled the bar lock with visible reluctance and held the door open 6 inches. Lydia didn't look back at any of them. She pushed the door open and stepped through. The smell hit her first, the specific combination of canine stress hormones, antiseptic, and something underneath both of those that she recognized, but hadn't smelled in a long time. The room felt different from inside, larger than it looked through the glass, colder. The 5 dogs had all stopped moving the moment the door opened, and now they were arranged in a loose arc across the far side of the room, watching her. She stood still. She let them look. She kept her hands at her sides. Her body turned slightly, not confrontational, not submissive, just present. She breathed slowly and she kept her gaze soft, not making direct eye contact with any of them, looking at the general space between them instead of fixing on faces. 10 seconds, 20. Nero the Malinois, the one driving everything, took one step toward her. His ears were up. His tail was low but not tucked. His eyes were locked on her with an intensity that had nothing aggressive in it. He took another step. Lydia spoke very quietly. Easy. I'm not here to make you do anything. Nero stopped. His head tilted a fraction of an inch, the tiny movement that dogs made when a sound matched something in their memory, and they weren't sure yet what to do with that. The 4 other dogs, a German Shepherd, 2 Dutch Shepherds, and a Labrador Retriever, whose presence in this unit made no immediate sense to anyone who hadn't been cleared for the specifics of why he was there, all shifted their attention between Nero and Lydia in rapid oscillation. She took one step forward. Then she lowered herself to one knee. Not all the way to the floor, that would have been too much, too fast, but enough to change her profile, to make herself smaller, less vertical, less like every other human who had walked into this room today, with intent and authority radiating off them like heat. The Labrador moved first. His name was Gravel, though she didn't know that yet, and he was the least expected one, the softest appearing. The one the handlers had probably been watching least carefully, because he didn't look like a threat. He crossed the room in a slow diagonal, reached her, and pushed his nose into the side of her neck. She didn't move. She let him smell her. She felt his breath, warm and rhythmic, against her collar. Then Nero came, not cautiously, directly, purposefully, with the specific economy of movement that highly trained working dogs used when they'd made a decision and were acting on it. He stopped 6 inches from her face and stared at her with those dark, serious eyes, and then he did something that made every person watching through the observation window go very quiet. He sat down. Military working dogs didn't sit for strangers. They didn't voluntarily reduce their defensive posture for unknown civilians in contained environments. It went against months of conditioning, against operational instinct, against everything their training had built into them. Nero sat down in front of Lydia Carter and looked at her like she was something he'd been waiting for. The German Shepherd came next, then the 2 Dutch Shepherds, the whole sequence taking less than 90 seconds. And when it was done, all 5 dogs were arranged around her, in the same loose arc they'd been maintaining across the room, except now they were facing outward from her, not toward her, watching the door, watching the walls, not sweeping for threats because they were anxious and in pain and running on fractured instincts, guarding her. Through the observation window, Commander Walker stood very still, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the expression of a man whose entire understanding of a situation had just been dismantled and was currently in the process of being rebuilt from scratch. Next to him, Kowalski had stopped pretending he wasn't shaken. "What is she doing?" Kowalski said. Walker didn't answer immediately. He was watching Lydia move through the room with the dogs orbiting her like satellites, checking Nero's leg without restraining him, letting him lean into her examination rather than forcing compliance, assessing each dog in turn with a calm, methodical efficiency that was nothing like what a floor nurse was supposed to know how to do. "I don't know," Walker said finally, "but she's done it before." Inside the containment room, Lydia finished her assessment of Nero's leg, sat back on her heels, and pressed the flat of her palm against his shoulder. He pushed back into the pressure the way dogs did when they wanted contact, when they were grounding themselves against something solid and familiar. She knew this dog, not this specific dog. She'd never met Nero before. But she knew what was behind his eyes, the language he was speaking with his body, the particular quality of his attention. She knew it because she'd spent 3 years of her life learning it in circumstances that had never made it into any personnel file associated with the name Lydia Carter. She kept her face still. She kept her hands steady. She didn't let herself think about what Walker's question was going to open up, or what answering it was going to cost her. Afterward, she told herself. She would deal with it afterward. Right now, there were 5 dogs who needed care, and that was the only thing that mattered. She worked through the room, methodically checking water levels, examining paw pads for abrasion, running her hands along each dog's flanks and spine and neck, cataloging the physical stress markers the way she'd been taught to years ago in a program that officially didn't exist. The German Shepherd, massive steel gray, with a scar running through his left ear that told a story she'd probably never hear, leaned against her side and stayed there for the entire time she worked on the others, like he was anchoring himself to her. She checked the monitoring stations along the wall, the automated systems that tracked vitals, body temperature, stress hormone indicators. 2 of them had been damaged in the initial incident. She made note of what was still functioning, what she could read from the data. The dogs were exhausted, all of them. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from extended combat cycles, followed by medical procedures, followed by whatever environmental stressor had set off this morning's cascade. They needed quiet, consistent care, reduced stimulus and time. They needed someone to stop treating them like malfunctioning equipment and start treating them like living things that had been through something terrible. She straightened up. Nero followed her movement, tracking her without getting up. "I need to talk to whoever is responsible for their care rotation," she said, loud enough to carry through the observation window. Walker's voice came through the wall speaker. "That's me. Then we need to talk about their protocol. All of it. What they've been given, how often the handlers have been cycling through, what the light and noise levels have been in here." She paused. "And I need Nero to see a vet today." "Not a vet. That suture site is inflamed and I want it professionally evaluated before it causes a secondary complication." A beat of silence from the speaker. "Copy that," Walker said. His voice had changed. It wasn't deferential, that wasn't who he was, but the specific dismissive edge was gone from it. He was speaking to her the way he'd speak to someone whose assessment he'd decided to take seriously. "Come out when you're ready, we'll debrief." She looked at the dogs around her. Nero hadn't moved from his position near her left side. The Labrador Gravel had gone to sleep with his chin on her shoe. "Give me 5 more minutes," she said. She spent those 5 minutes the way she'd spent the last hour, quietly, deliberately, without any of the sharp urgency that had characterized every human interaction in this room since 400. She let the room settle. She let the dog settle. She let the particular quality of attention that had been present in her since she was 19 years old, and learning things in places she'd never named out loud do what it had always done: read the living things in it, and figure out what they needed. When she finally stood and moved toward the door, all 5 dogs rose with her. They walked her to the entry point like an escort, stopping at a precise line near the door, not blocking her exit, just present. She looked back at them once. Nero looked back at her. His ears were forward. His expression, as much as a dog had an expression, was steady. She went through the door. The corridor outside felt 10 degrees colder and 20 decibels louder than it had 60 seconds ago. The handlers, the medics, the 2 MPs who'd arrived at some point during the last hour, they were all looking at her. Most of them were trying to make the look like something other than what it was, which was pure, unvarnished bewilderment. Walker was standing 3 feet from the door. He had his arms uncrossed now, which she noted. "Lydia Carter," he said, "3rd floor nursing staff." He said it the same way she had, but the tone underneath it was completely different. "Yes," she said. "You want to tell me why those dogs responded to you the way they just did?" She thought about deflecting. She thought about the careful construction she'd spent 14 months building, the unremarkable nurse, the competent but invisible presence, the woman whose history was exactly as simple as it appeared on paper. She thought about how much easier everything would be if she just said something plausible and walked away. "Not particularly," she said instead. "But I think you're going to ask me some questions that are going to make it difficult to avoid." "That's an accurate assessment." He held her gaze. "My office. When you're ready." She nodded. She should have been worried. 14 months of deliberate quiet, deliberate ordinariness, deliberate erasure from anything connected to who she'd been before all of it, was now functionally compromised. Walker was going to pull her personnel file and find it clean, because the people who'd processed her paperwork had been careful, but he was also going to be making calls that her paperwork wasn't going to be able to withstand. He was a special operations commander with clearances she couldn't estimate, and he'd just watched her walk into a room full of destabilized military working dogs and bring them to heel in under an hour. He was not going to let that go. She walked down the corridor toward the elevator, and she was acutely aware that her hands were shaking slightly inside her pockets, not from fear, or not entirely from fear. Also from something that had been locked away so long that it didn't have a clean name anymore. She'd recognized those dogs, not individually, but she'd recognized the quality of their training, the the specific markers of the program they'd come through, the behavioral signatures that only appeared in one particular kind of unit that had operated under one particular contractor for 3 years, beginning in 2019. She'd helped build that program. And if these dogs were here, in Harbor Ridge Military Hospital in Phoenix, the behavioral pattern she'd just observed, if they were in this facility, under this level of classification, with this kind of reactivity to standard handler contact, then something had gone badly wrong. Not just recently. A long time ago. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. The doors slid closed behind her. Somewhere below her, in the quiet of the containment room, 5 military dogs settled into the closest things to resonance they'd had in weeks, and whatever signal Lydia Carter had brought into that room with her, whatever it was that lived in the space between who she'd been and who she'd been pretending to be, it was still present with them, like a frequency they could feel through the floor. On the 3rd floor, her medication cart was still sitting where she'd left it. The pharmacy had delivered the corrected dosage for bed 7. Everything was where she'd put it, waiting to be picked back up. She stood in the hallway for a moment, her hands out of her pockets now, and she looked at the ordinary work of an ordinary morning, and she understood with complete clarity that the ordinary was over. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, which in her world was never actually unknown. She stared at the screen. The message was 4 words. They found the dogs. She put the phone back in her pocket. She picked up her medication tray. She kept her face exactly as it needed to be, calm, unremarkable, the competent invisible nurse, and she walked toward bed 7. But her mind was already moving through a set of calculations she hadn't run in 3 years, and at the center of those calculations was a name she hadn't said out loud since the day she'd signed the paperwork that was supposed to make her vanish. Black Ridge. Black Ridge. The name sat in her chest like a piece of shrapnel present, specific and impossible to ignore. She had spent 3 years learning not to think about it, and now it was back in 4 words on a screen from a number that didn't exist. And she knew with the kind of certainty that settled in the stomach rather than the head that the next few hours were going to determine things she wasn't ready to have determined. She finished the medication round. She documented every entry with the same care she always applied, initialed every form, checked every IV line. She did this because the work mattered regardless of what else was happening, and because the part of her that had been trained to function under pressure understood that maintaining routine was not avoidance, it was discipline. At 11:42, she got a second message from the same number. Don't talk to him yet. She deleted both messages, locked her phone, and walked to Walker's office. He'd had time to pull her file. She could tell from the way he was standing when she came in, not behind his desk, but beside it. Arms crossed, the file open on the surface in front of him like he'd been looking at it, and decided to stop before she arrived. The file would be thin. 3 pages of employment records, professional references, nursing certifications from the University of Arizona, and a 2-year hospital residency in Tucson. No gaps that weren't explained, no red flags, clean, continuous, boring. The people who built her cover story had been meticulous. Sit down, he said, and his voice was neutral in the specific way that meant he'd decided not to lead with whatever reaction he'd actually had. She sat. She put her hands on her knees. She looked at him directly because looking away would have been a worse signal. How long have you worked with military working dogs? He said. I don't work with military working dogs, she said. I'm a nurse. That's not what I asked. She kept her face steady. It's a complicated answer. I've got time. She looked at him for a moment, not performing hesitation, actually deciding. Walker was not the problem. He never had been. The problem was the message on her phone and the name it contained, and the people behind that name who had already demonstrated that they were comfortable with solutions that didn't involve official channels. I've had exposure to working dog behavior in a medical context, she said. It was a long time ago, and it's not something I've discussed with the facility. How long ago? Long enough that it shouldn't be relevant, except that apparently it is. Walker pulled his chair out and sat down across from her, which changed the dynamic in the room, less interrogation, more deliberate conversation. He was smart enough to know that pushing her directly wasn't going to get him anywhere useful. Those dogs reacted to you like they knew you, he said. Not like you were a familiar stimulus or a non-threatening presence. Like they knew you specifically. I'm aware of how it looked. You were their handler. It wasn't a question. She didn't confirm or deny it. She let the silence do what silence did. Walker leaned forward. I'm not going to pretend I don't have concerns, Carter, because I do. But right now, my more immediate concern is that those animals have been in crisis for 6 hours. I've had 2 handlers injured. and one who might be dealing with a broken finger that he hasn't reported because he doesn't want to be pulled from duty. And whatever is wrong with them, you apparently understand it in a way nobody else in this facility does. He paused. So here's where I land. I need your help with the dogs. After that conversation is complete, we're going to have a different conversation. Does that work for you? It was more reasonable than she'd expected. She wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. Yes, she said. He stood, and she stood with him, and he walked her back down to sublevel 2, with the kind of efficiency that came from a man who was good at compartmentalizing, putting one problem in one box, the other problem in another, and handling them in sequence rather than simultaneously. She respected that. She did the same thing herself. The dogs were calmer when she came back. Not calm, not by a long margin, but the active distress of the morning had settled into something closer to watchful tension. When the containment door opened and she stepped in, Nero lifted his head and the quality of his attention changed immediately, the way animals tracked things that mattered to them, on a frequency that had nothing to do with cognition. She spent the next 2 hours in that room. She didn't do anything dramatic or difficult to understand. She sat on the floor. She let the dogs come to her on their own timeline. She talked to them the way she used to, low, continuous, the kind of quiet verbal stream that gave them something to anchor their attention to, without demanding anything from them in return. She worked on Nero's leg with a careful, methodical gentleness that he tolerated better than she'd hoped. She checked each of the others for secondary stress markers, tension in the shoulders, protective postures, the specific eye behavior that indicated elevated cortisol, and noted what she found in a log she asked Walker's medic to bring her. Walker watched from the corridor. She was aware of him out there, and she was aware of the second person who joined him about 40 minutes in a woman she didn't recognize, in civilian clothes but standing with the posture of someone accustomed to military spaces. The woman watched through the observation glass, with an intensity that was different from Walker's, less confused, more focused, like someone looking for confirmation of something they already suspected. Lydia kept her face neutral. She kept her hands working. She wrote in her log and examined Nero's suture line, and told the German shepherd whose intake tag said Rook that he was being very good, even though he was tense enough to vibrate. When she finally came out, the unknown woman was still there. Dr. Priya Vasquez, Walker said. She's our on-call veterinary consultant. The suture on Nero's rear left leg needs to be reopened, and the tissue underneath needs to be inspected, Lydia said before the introduction could go further. I think there's a small abscess forming. It's not deep, but it needs attention today. Vasquez blinked. She was a compact woman in her 40s with thick-framed glasses, and the kind of measured composure that came from working around animals in pain, for long enough that composure became structural rather than chosen. You got close enough to assess that? He let me. He put a handler in the emergency room this morning. I know. Vasquez looked at her with the same kind of recalibration Walker had done earlier, that rapid, involuntary assessment. Then she looked at Walker, then back at Lydia. I'll need to examine him myself to confirm. Of course, Lydia said. Do you want me in there when you do it? Another pause. That might be useful. They went back in together. Vasquez worked efficiently and without fuss, and Nero allowed her examination with Lydia's hand resting lightly on his shoulder in the specific position that signaled to him, to any dog trained under the protocol she'd helped develop, that the person approaching was cleared. It was a gesture so subtle that nobody watching would have known what it meant. That was the point. It had always been the point. Vasquez confirmed the abscess. She made arrangements for a minor procedure that afternoon. She came out of the containment room, looking thoughtful in a way that suggested she had questions she hadn't decided whether to ask yet. How did you know? She said outside. Experience, Lydia said, the same non-answer she'd given Walker. She could see from Vasquez's expression that it landed exactly as unsatisfying as it deserved to. Walker had been standing back during the veterinary assessment, watching. Now he stepped forward. My office, he said, both of you. The second conversation was harder than the first. Walker laid out what he knew, which was more than Lydia had estimated. Not about her specifically. He still didn't have anything concrete about her background, beyond the careful fiction in her file, but about the dogs. He knew their unit designation. He knew they'd been through 3 overseas deployments, 2 in active theater. He knew their handler rotation, their medical histories, their performance assessments. He also knew, and this was the part that made her stomach tight, that their previous classified handler assignment, the one before the standard rotation, had been administratively sealed at a classification level that was above his clearance to access. which means someone with significant pull decided that information needed to not exist, he said. Those dogs came to this facility 6 weeks ago for what was described to me as standard post-deployment medical care. Nobody told me the unit classification on their behavioral protocol, and nobody told me their previous assignment was sealed. His jaw tightened. I don't like being managed with incomplete information when I'm responsible for the safety of my personnel. No, Lydia said. You wouldn't. Do you know what the sealed assignment was? She looked at him. She looked at Vasquez, who was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood. She was listening to something significant. I need to know what access you have before I answer that, Lydia said. Lydia. Walker's voice was flat. 2 of my people got hurt this morning. I have 5 military working dogs in my sub-level who are clearly in distress that goes beyond what their official files document. And the only person in this building who can go into that room without getting torn apart is a floor nurse whose personnel file reads like it was written by someone who knows how to write personnel files. He let that sit for a second. If you know something about those dogs that I need to know, you need to tell me. She sat with that. Outside the window, Phoenix shimmered under mid-morning heat. A transport vehicle was moving across the facility's outer lot. Ordinary. Everything looked ordinary from the right distance. Black Ridge, she said. Walker went still. It was the stillness of recognition he'd heard the name. Maybe not in detail. Maybe only as a reference point in a briefing he'd received years ago that he'd filed and not revisited. But he knew the name. What about it? He said carefully. The dogs were part of a Black Ridge subprogram. Pre-deployment behavioral conditioning and trauma stabilization, the official description, was enhanced resilience protocol for high-value K9 assets. What it actually was, she said, and she kept her voice even, was an experimental behavioral modification program that went significantly beyond what was disclosed in its ethics review. They were conditioning combat stress responses, not treating them, testing specific stimuli to optimize aggression thresholds, using the dogs as data points. The silence in the room had weight. How do you know that? Walker said. Because I was part of the team that was supposed to be stabilizing them after the conditioning cycles, she said. I was brought in as a behavioral specialist the program recruited from veterinary behavioral science, not military channels. 3 of us on the recovery side. We were told we were part of a trauma rehabilitation pilot. She paused. It took about 4 months to understand what we were actually rehabilitating them from. Vasquez, who hadn't spoken in 20 minutes, said, "What did you do when you understood?" "I documented everything I could access, and I tried to report it through the proper channels." A flat, short laugh that wasn't really a laugh. The proper channels were owned by the same people running the program. So I did what I could with what I had. I got those 5 dogs out of the active conditioning phase through medical means that I documented as necessity rather than intervention, and then I disappeared from the program before they could make a decision about what to do with me. Disappeared meaning someone helped me become Lydia Carter, floor nurse, with a very clean file and a very quiet 14 months in Phoenix. She looked at Walker, and until 6 hours ago that was working fine. Walker stood up. He walked to his window. He put one hand against the frame and looked out at the lot below, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was running through the implications of what she'd just told him, and they were not small implications. "Someone sent you a message this morning," he said. Not a question. She didn't ask how he knew. "Yes. About the dogs. About Black Ridge knowing where the dogs are." He turned around. "Then whoever sent it is warning you that the program is active enough to monitor this facility's patient roster."
Yes.
"Which means they have access to classified intake records. Or they have someone inside this facility," she said. "One or the other. Possibly both." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 3 degrees. Vasquez took off her glasses and cleaned them with the hem of her shirt, a gesture so human and automatic that it was almost jarring. "Those dogs," Vasquez said slowly. "The reason they responded to you. It wasn't just familiarity." "No," Lydia said. "The program built something into them. A specific response pattern. A trust anchor," Lydia said. Part of the stabilization work was building a baseline human contact point into their behavioral architecture so when they associated with safety rather than demand. It was supposed to make the conditioning cycles more effective by giving them a recovery state to return to. She stopped. "I was that anchor for 5 of them. I didn't know that's what they were using me for. By the time I understood it, it was already built." Walker said, "Can they undo it?" "Black Ridge thinks they can." He went very still again. "That's what the memory wipe system is," she said. "That's what they'll use if they get access to those dogs." It's not just erasing training data, it's ablating the specific neurological pathways associated with the trust anchor. It'll work. Mostly. But it'll damage them. She kept her voice clinical because that was the only way she could say it out loud. Permanently. There's a reason I tried to stop the program before they got that far. Walker crossed back to his desk. He sat down. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the assessing professional distance of the morning, but something more direct, more personal, the look of someone who was deciding something, and wanted to make sure he was deciding it clearly. "Are you safe right now?" he said. The question surprised her. She'd expected next steps, logistics, protocol. Not that. "I don't know," she said honestly. "The person who sent you the message, are they reliable?" "They were 3 years ago." "And you haven't been in contact since?" "No." He nodded slowly. He looked at his desk. He looked at the thin file on it, her file, the fictional one, and then he pushed it aside like it was no longer relevant, which she supposed it wasn't. "I'm going to need to make some calls," he said. "People I trust, not channels. This doesn't go through standard reporting until I know who in this facility has access to the intake roster." He looked at her. "Which means you stay in the building. You don't go to your floor. You don't talk to anyone you don't need to talk to. You stay near those dogs. Because right now that room is the one place in this building where I can keep eyes on you without it looking like I'm keeping eyes on you. You want me to stay in the containment wing. I want you where I can see you and where the dogs are calm enough that my medics can actually do their jobs." He said it without apology. "I'll get you a cot if the afternoon runs long." She almost smiled. "Almost I've slept on worse." She meant it as nothing a throwaway line. But Walker caught something in it. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone filing information away. "I'll get you something to eat," he said instead. The afternoon moved differently than the morning had. Slower in some ways, more pressurized in others. Vasquez completed Nero's minor procedure in the containment room with Lydia present, and it went cleanly. The abscess was small, superficial, nothing that would cause long-term damage now that it had been addressed. Nero tolerated the procedure with a cooperation that made Vasquez go quiet in a way that suggested she was thinking about things she wasn't ready to say. The other 4 dogs cycled through their stress responses in a lower register now. The acute crisis converted into something more chronic. Lydia could work with chronic. She moved through the room, adjusted the environmental controls where she could reducing overhead light intensity, requesting that the ventilation be set to a lower cycle rate that reduced ambient noise, and documented everything in a log that was becoming more detailed by the hour. Walker came in twice. Not to talk, just to stand near the observation window for a few minutes, and then leave again. She understood what he was doing. Monitoring. Making sure the situation remained what it appeared to be. She didn't mind. At 3:17 in the afternoon, her phone buzzed again. She looked at it under the level of the observation window, angled so the camera mounted in the upper corner of the containment room. She'd clocked it on her first walkthrough, couldn't read the screen. The message was longer this time. They pulled the intake roster 6 hours before the incident. "The person who pulled it has a Phoenix area code. You need to find out who on Walker's staff has been making personal calls in the last 48 hours. It's not Walker." She read it twice. Deleted it. She looked at Gravel, the Labrador, who was watching her from across the room with his head tilted at the familiar angle. "I know," she said very quietly. "I know." She needed to get to Walker without being obvious about needing to get to Walker, which was complicated by the fact that she was currently contained in a sublevel room with military working dogs and a veterinary consultant. She needed to do it in a way that didn't tip off whoever was in this facility, watching things that shouldn't be visible. She stood up and walked to the room speaker. "Dr. Vasquez, can you come in? Rook is showing some gum coloring I want a second opinion on." It was a minor thing, the kind of thing that happened. Vasquez came in, examined Rook, agreed the gum coloring was slightly off but not alarming, suggested monitoring through the evening. Normal, unremarkable. While Vasquez was examining Rook, Lydia moved to the door and pressed the intercom for the corridor. One of the junior medics was out there, a young specialist named Dwyer, who'd been rotating through the observation position all afternoon. "I need Commander Walker when he has a minute," she said. "Tell him it's about the monitoring log. He'll know what I mean." He didn't know what she meant, but it would get Walker down here without looking like a summons. 8 minutes later, Walker came through the corridor door. He looked at her through the observation glass. First a quick read of the room, making sure everything was as she'd implied. Then he stepped into the containment entry. She met him at the door. "Personal calls," she said very low. Someone on your staff with a Phoenix area code, last 48 hours. Your intake roster was accessed 6 hours before the dogs went into crisis this morning. Walker's face did something complicated and then went still. How do you know that? The same way I knew to delete the messages. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Don't move from this room, he said. I know. He left. She went back to Rook, who accepted her return with the mild enthusiasm of a dog who didn't hold brief absences against people. Vasquez looked at her. Everything okay? Fine, Lydia said. Just a question about the log protocol. Vasquez held her gaze for a beat too long. She was perceptive, the kind of perceptive that came with a profession that required reading patients who couldn't speak, and Lydia could see her processing the gap between what was being said and what was actually happening in this room. But she didn't push. She went back to her notes. She was either tactful enough or experienced enough to understand that there were situations where the best thing to do was your job and nothing else. An hour passed, then 90 minutes. The facility's afternoon shift change happened somewhere above them. Lydia could tell from the change in foot traffic sounds in the corridor outside, and the light through the observation window shifted to the particular quality of late afternoon. Sun that Phoenix did better than anywhere else, turning the institutional beige of everything to something briefly almost warm. Walker came back at 5:41. He stood at the observation window. His expression was the controlled version of something she recognized: controlled fury, the kind that came from a specific kind of betrayal. Not dramatic, worse than dramatic, quiet and cold and exact. She went to the door. Staff Sergeant Marcus Oren, Walker said. His voice was very flat. On-site security rotation. 3 personal calls in the last 40 hours, all to a number registered to a logistics company in Scottsdale. The company doesn't have a public profile. A pause. He requested a shift assignment to the sub-level 12 hours before the incident. Lydia closed her eyes for 1 second. Opened them. Where is he now? In my office, Walker said, with 2 MPs. Does he know why? He knows something is wrong. He doesn't know what I know. His jaw set. I want to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I decide how to handle this. Because if this connects to what you told me this afternoon, the program, the dogs, the access log, then what I'm looking at is not a personnel issue. It's a penetration of a classified facility by an organization that has demonstrated willingness to damage military assets for operational purposes. Yes, she said. That's what you're looking at. He was quiet for a moment. Behind her in the room, she could hear Rook settle into a change of position, the sound of a large dog making small adjustments against the floor. They're going to come here, Walker said. It wasn't a question. They'll send someone official looking, Lydia said. A recovery team. Transfer orders. Everything documented, everything stamped, everything that looks like it went through the right channels. And if I let the transfer happen, those dogs disappear. The program finishes what it started. And anyone who knows what the program actually did, she stopped. Gets managed, Walker said. Yes. He looked at her through the reinforced glass of the containment door. This floor nurse in blue scrubs, who had walked into his facility 14 months ago with a spotless fake resume and a history she'd buried carefully enough that it almost worked, and she could see him making a decision. Not the small decision of the morning, which had about operational necessity. A larger one, the kind that had weight on both ends. I'm going to make 2 calls, he said. People I've worked with for a long time, outside this facility's chain of command. I'm going to get us some cover before whatever is coming comes. He held her gaze. I need you to stay here tonight. I know. And I need you to tell me everything you remember about Black Ridge's recovery team protocols. Specifically how they present, what documentation they bring, and what their standard approach looks like when they move to acquire an asset. She nodded. He started to turn. Then he stopped. Carter. Yes. Those dogs. He looked through the glass at them at Nero, who had lifted his head toward Walker with the same attention he gave everything, calm and measuring. You said the trust anchor, what you built, with them you didn't know they were using you for that. That's right. But it was real. What you built with them. She looked at the dogs, at Nero, at Rook, at Gravel, still watching her from across the room with patient, serious eyes. Yes, she said, it was real. Walker held that for a moment. Then he nodded once. The way people nodded when something answered a question they hadn't wanted to ask out loud, and he walked away down the corridor. Lydia turned back to the room. She sat down on the floor, and Gravel immediately repositioned himself against her left side, a warm weight, steady and present. Her phone was silent. Outside this building, somewhere in the city's sprawling grid, something was moving. She could feel it the way you felt the pressure change before a storm not visible yet, not audible, but there. Real. Already in motion. And in the facility above her in Walker's office, Staff Sergeant Marcus Oren was sitting across from two military police officers, and whatever story he'd been prepared to tell was about to meet the specific kind of questioning that Walker had spent a career getting very good at. The door to the containment room was locked from the outside. The dogs were quiet. The afternoon was sliding toward evening, and the last light through the corridor window was turning the color of something that would be beautiful if you had the attention to spare for it. Lydia didn't. She was thinking about transfer orders and documentation, and the specific face of a man she'd worked with for 3 years, who had smiled at her every morning and told her the program was important, and then, when she'd tried to end it, had filed paperwork that made her cease to exist in every official record he could reach. She was thinking about what came next, and somewhere in the network of calls that Walker was making the off-channel, trusted, careful calls, a name she didn't know yet, was being connected to a location that would matter very soon, and a team that had been built for exactly this kind of situation was beginning to understand that Harbor Ridge Military Hospital in Phoenix was no longer a routine medical facility assignment. It was the center of something that had been waiting 3 years to finish being resolved. The calls Walker made that evening were not long. That was how she knew they were the right kind people who understood the situation, quickly didn't need it explained twice, and people he actually trusted didn't require him to justify why he was calling outside the chain of command at 6 in the evening on a Tuesday. She heard fragments through the corridor wall while Vasquez ran a final vitals check on the dogs, and Lydia updated her log with the day's observations. Walker's voice was low and controlled, the cadence of a man choosing every word with purpose. She couldn't make out specifics. She didn't try. She focused on her documentation, on the dogs, on the particular quality of Nero's breathing, which had shifted in the last hour, from the short, pressurized cycles of stress to something longer and less labored. He was sleeping when Vasquez finished. All 5 of them were in the loose, semi-alert way that working dogs slept, not fully down, not fully off, their bodies resting while their instincts stayed present. Vasquez packed her kit and stood up and looked at the dogs for a long moment. "I've been doing this for 19 years, she said. "I've never seen a unit respond to a single contact the way they respond to you." "I know how it looks," Lydia said. "I don't think you do." Vasquez looked at her. "It doesn't look strange. That's the thing. It looks completely natural, like you belong in that room, and they know it. That's what's strange about it. Usually when something looks that natural, it's because it took a very long time to build." Lydia didn't answer. Vasquez seemed to understand that the non-answer was the answer, and she didn't push it further. She said goodnight to the dogs practically and without self-consciousness, the way people with long careers in animal medicine addressed their patients, and left through the corridor. Walker came in at 8:47. He had coffee, 2 cups, and he handed her one without asking if she wanted it, which she appreciated because she did, and asking would have been a waste of time. "2 people are coming in the morning," he said. "Colonel Diane Farrow, JAG Corps, and Major Terrence Bale, Defense Intelligence. I've worked with both of them. They're clean, and they're cleared above my level, which means they'll have access to the sealed assignment files." He sat down on the folding chair someone had brought into the observation area at some point during the afternoon. "Farrow is going to want your testimony. Everything you told me, formal and documented." "I know." "Bale is going to want to know about the program specifically, the methodology, the documentation you said you pulled before you disappeared. Is any of that accessible?" "Some of it," she said. "Not from here," he looked at her. "But accessible. If I can get to a specific location, yes." He absorbed that. "We'll talk about it in the morning, with Farrow and Bale present." He drank his coffee. It was a utilitarian gesture fuel, not pleasure. Oren talked, he said. Not everything enough. He confirmed he'd been providing facility access and information to an outside party for the last 3 months. He believed he was working with a legitimate DoD contractor doing a compliance audit, a pause that carried a specific kind of weight. He didn't know what the information was being used for, or says he didn't. You believe him? "I think he's a 23-year-old staff sergeant who got played by people who are very good at playing people." Another pause, which doesn't make what he did acceptable. "But it changes what he is." Lydia nodded. That was a fair read. Black Ridge had always been good at finding people who were useful without knowing they were being used. It was part of the operational architecture, maintain distance between the people who understood the program and the people who enabled it. Keep the handlers separate from the strategy. It made accountability nearly impossible, which was precisely the design. "Get some sleep," Walker said. He stood up. "I had Kowalski bring down a cot. It's in the side room." He gestured toward the small adjoining space that served as a handler rest area. I'll have someone outside the corridor all night. You don't need to do that. I know I don't need to. He picked up his cup, finished the last of it. I'm doing it anyway. He left. She sat with the dogs and the silence, and the particular quality of late-night institutional air, recycled, slightly too cold, carrying the traces of everything the building had processed through the course of the day. Rook had migrated during the evening until he was sleeping with his back against the wall, near the containment room's interior door, positioned precisely where a working dog would position himself if he were maintaining a watch point. She didn't know if it was training or instinct or the residue of 3 years of someone teaching him that certain positions meant something. She thought about all 3 possibilities for a while, and then she went to the cot and lay down and listened to the dogs breathe. She woke at 4 in the morning to Nero standing over her. Not aggressively. He was just there standing at the side of the cot with his head at her level, looking at her with the specific attention he'd been giving her since she first walked into the containment room. She lay still for a moment, orienting. The facility's overnight silence had a different texture than its daytime noise, and the sublevel had its own particular quality, muffled, contained, the kind of quiet that felt thick rather than empty. Something had changed. She couldn't have articulated it. It was a pressure shift, a subtle wrongness in the ambient sound of the building, the way large facilities had rhythms that you learned without noticing you were learning them. And when those rhythms broke, something in the body registered it before the conscious mind caught up. She sat up. Nero stepped back, watching her. She went to the containment room. All 5 dogs were awake, not distressed alert. The distinction was important, and she'd learned to read it precisely. Distress was reactive, chaotic, driven by stimulus the animal couldn't process. This was directed attention. They were tracking something. She pressed the corridor intercom. This is Carter. Who's on the overnight watch? A pause, then a voice she didn't recognize. Specialist Howe, ma'am. Everything okay in there? Is anything happening in the building? Any vehicle traffic at the outer lot? Another pause, longer. Hold on. She could hear him moving, the sound of a radio being keyed. Then there's a 3-vehicle convoy at the east gate. Just arrived. They're showing transfer documentation. Her stomach dropped. Do not clear the gate, she said. Call Commander Walker right now. Do not clear the gate. Ma'am, the documentation specialist Howe. She kept her voice flat and exact. Call Commander Walker now. She released the intercom and turned back to the dogs. They were still arranged in their alert pattern, watchful, tracking, held by the same invisible signal that had woken Nero and brought him to her. She went back to the cot and found her shoes and put them on. She did this methodically, because methodical was what the situation required, and because the alternative was allowing the cold, specific fear that was moving through her chest to find a foothold, and she couldn't afford that right now. She heard Walker's voice in the corridor 6 minutes later. He sounded like someone who'd been asleep 20 minutes ago and was fully operational now, the military version of awake, which skipped the transition phases that civilians moved through. He was on his radio, and she could hear him clearly through the intercom speaker that Specialist Howe had left open. Hold them at the gate. I don't care what the documentation says, nobody clears without my personal authorization. Get Kowalski and Reyes to the east entry, a beat. Yes, I said nobody. He came to the containment corridor 40 seconds later. His shirt was not entirely tucked, which she noted as a human detail she'd probably never have another occasion to notice. He looked at her through the observation glass, and then came through the corridor door. 3 vehicles, she said. Black Ridge? The documentation says Joint Recovery and Asset Transfer Command, which is a designation I've encountered once before, in a briefing 3 years ago, and which does not have a publicly accessible organizational address. His jaw was set in the way it got, when something was confirming a conclusion he'd already reached. It's them. How long until Farrow and Bale can be here? Farrow's 2 hours out. Bale is 40 minutes. He stayed at the Marriott on Central. He looked at her. I have legal authority to deny the transfer, but that authority has limits. If they have proper chain documentation, at some point I'm going to need a JAG officer physically present to contest it on the record. Then we need Bale here, before you let them in the gate. Working on it. He looked at the dogs through the glass. They were all facing the door now, not the containment door, the corridor door, the external one, as if they could hear something through 3 floors of facility and a reinforced outer wall that the humans couldn't. Do they know something is here? They're reading the building, Lydia said. Changes in ambient vibration, vehicle engines, People moving in patterns that are different from the usual overnight rhythm. She paused. They've done this before. Read an environment before a contact. Walker absorbed that. He went back to his radio. The next 40 minutes were the specific kind of tense that came from a situation where the pressure was real, but the action hadn't started yet, all of the weight, none of the release. Walker coordinated his people with the tight efficiency of someone who'd run more complex situations than this, but she could see the constraint in it, the awareness that he was operating with a narrow margin. 3 vehicles. He didn't know how many people. He didn't know their armament. He didn't know whether their documentation, whatever it was, had been built well enough to create a legal obligation he couldn't deny. Major Bale arrived at 4:52. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of someone moving through the facility with military issue speed, the kind of movement that didn't apologize for itself. He was taller than she'd expected, lean and dark-skinned, with the distilled focus of someone who'd been woken by a phone call and processed the information on the drive over, so he arrived already operational. Walker briefed him in 90 seconds, outside her containment corridor. She heard everything. Bale asked 3 questions, all of them precise. The designation on the transfer documentation, the number of vehicles, and whether Walker had initiated a facility lockdown. Initiating now, Walker said. Good. Don't let them in the gate until I've seen the documentation myself. Bale's voice dropped slightly. And the asset we're talking about, the behavioral specialist. Where is she? Right here, Lydia said through the intercom. A pause. Then Bale appeared at the corridor window. He looked at her with the same rapid assessment she'd been receiving all day. The professional scan that looked at everything and filed it simultaneously. Carter, I've read your file. The real one, she went still. There isn't a real one. There is now, he said. Farrow and I pulled what exists in the sealed system before we came. It's partial. Whoever sanitized your record was good. But there's enough. He held her gaze. You were on record as a level 3 behavioral specialist with the Kelmar Institute. Kelmar was the civilian contractor that managed the recovery side of Black Ridge's K9 program. Your record shows you were administratively separated in March 2022, and this is the actual language, persistent non-compliance with operational parameters. That's the last entry. Yes, she said. That's accurate. The K9 unit, currently in that room, their sealed assignment reads as Kelmar Institute, Phase 3 conditioning. Dates matching your active period. He glanced at Walker. And the recovery team outside is running under a joint recovery designation that traces back to a DoD contractor called Artis Group. Artis Group and Kelmar Institute share 2 board members and a parent holding company registered in Delaware. The shape of it was fully visible now. It had always been fully visible to her, but she hadn't had documentation, and documentation was what the next few hours needed. Can you hold them at the gate? She asked. For a limited time, Bale said. I'm going to go look at their documentation personally. In the meantime, I need you to tell me one thing. He looked at her directly. The program documentation you pulled before you left. You told Walker it's accessible. If we need it as evidentiary support in the next few hours, can you get it? I need my phone and an encrypted connection, she said. Walker looked at Bale. Bale nodded. Walker handed her a phone, not hers, a facility encrypted device, and said it routes through a secure server. Use it. She took the phone. Bale went to the gate. Walker stayed. She made the connection. She needed a routed access to a server she'd set up 3 years ago and maintained at a cost she'd been paying quietly out of a bank account that also wasn't in Lydia Carter's name, and she pulled the files. They were intact. 47 documents. Clinical logs, protocol records, 2 internal communications between Kelmar's program director and an Artis Group executive that explicitly discussed the dog's conditioning as asset enhancement rather than medical care. Photographs of the conditioning procedures. Her own reports, the ones she'd submitted through official channels, stamped with the date and her specialist designation, and then stamped again with closed no action by someone whose authority she'd never been able to trace. She transferred everything to Bale's secure DIA address. It took 11 minutes. When it was done, she sat on the floor of the handler rest area with the phone in her lap and felt the particular exhaustion that came from carrying something for a very long time and then setting it down, not relief exactly, because the situation was not over, but a specific loosening in her shoulders and chest that she hadn't realized was there until it moved. Nero had followed her into the rest area and was sitting beside her, pressed against her left side with the weight of an animal that had decided where it was going to be and didn't intend to revise that decision. She put her hand on his shoulder. He didn't react. He was already there. Walker was in the corridor, on his radio. She could hear Bale's voice coming through. He was at the gate. He had the documentation in his hands. He was talking to whoever was leading the Black Ridge team. She couldn't make out the words, but she could make out the tone, which was the tone of a man applying professional authority to a situation that was trying to resist it. Then something changed. She heard it in Walker's posture before she heard it in his words, the shift from managed tension to something sharper. He turned toward her containment corridor and said, "Carter." Two of them went to the South Service entrance. "We have their inside the building." She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. "How?" she said. "Service access." Orrin gave them more than the intake roster. His jaw was tight. He gave them an access route. She processed that fast. South Service entrance that was 2 corridors and 1 elevator from sublevel 2. 3 minutes at a walking pace. Less if they moved with intent. "Lock this wing down," she said. "Already Kowalski, seal the sublevel access." Now he was on his radio again. "Moving, Carter. Get into the containment room. The dogs. Get in the room and stay there. My people will handle the corridor." She went into the containment room. The dogs were already in motion, not panic, not the chaotic response of the morning before, but the organized, directed alertness of animals who knew something was coming and had made their own assessment of it. They were arranged in a formation that had no civilian analog, but that she recognized from a training document she'd read years ago, a perimeter configuration, high-value asset protection. They'd assumed this shape without instruction. She stood in the center of it. The facility's lockdown protocol activated somewhere above her. She could hear the specific sound of the magnetic bolts on the fire doors engaging, the change in the ventilation system's tone that came with a facility-wide alert. The overhead lights shifted from their overnight dimness to full operational brightness. She heard footsteps in the corridor, not Walker's different rhythm, different weight distribution, the specific cadence of people who were moving with operational intent and not trying to sound like they weren't. The containment corridor door opened. 2 men came through. They were dressed in the gray and black of a private contractor's field team. No unit patches, no visible rank, equipment that was expensive and unmilitary in the specific way of things purchased for function rather than regulation. The first was large, thick through the shoulders, carrying himself with the controlled economy of someone with tactical training. The second was smaller, faster looking, and carrying a case black, hard-sided, the size of a laptop bag but heavier looking. They stopped when they saw the dogs. The formation the dogs had assumed made the room very small. 5 animals, each between 80 and 110 pounds, each trained to standards that the men in the doorway almost certainly knew about given who they worked for, arranged in a configuration that made the distance between any entry point and the center of the room look very short. The large man looked at Lydia. "Step away from the animals." "No," she said. "Ma'am, this is a deauthorized asset transfer. You're not cleared to obstruct. You entered a locked military medical facility through a service access without authorization from the commanding officer," she said. "The DoD transfer documentation you're holding is being reviewed by a defense intelligence officer at the East Gate right now. You should probably think carefully about what you do next." The large man didn't look rattled. He was trained not to look rattled. But the smaller one, the one with the case, glanced toward the door and then back, and that single glance told her something about his level of certainty in the situation. "The animals need to be secured," the large man said. "Stand aside." Nero made a sound. It was not a bark, it was lower than that, more deliberate, the specific vocalization that working dogs produced when they'd assessed a situation and had moved from alert to something closer to a commitment. The other 4 dogs shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible tightening of the formation. The smaller man took a step back toward the door. The large man stayed. He was looking at the dogs with the expression of someone revising their operational plan in real time. "What's in the case?" Lydia said. He didn't answer. "The neuromodulation equipment," she said. "The ablation system. That's what you brought." She kept her voice exactly as flat as it was. "It won't work the way you think it will. The protocol requires a pre-sedation phase, and you are not in a position to sedate these animals right now." His eyes moved to her. "You know a lot about the protocol." "I helped design the recovery portion of it," she said. "I know exactly what you need to run it and what happens when you try to run it without the correct preparation." She looked at the case. "You're also not going to get close enough to use it." As if in response to something, she hadn't consciously done a shift in her weight, a change in her breathing. Some signal below the threshold of anything she was aware of producing. Nero stepped forward. 1 step. Deliberate and precise. He stopped between her and the large man, and he looked at the man with his dark, serious eyes, and he did not make another sound. He didn't need to. The large man looked at the dog for a long moment. Then he looked at Lydia, and she could see in his face the specific calculation that happened when an operational plan met a variable it hadn't been built to accommodate. Walker's voice came from outside the corridor, loud, sharp, authoritative. Then the sound of additional footsteps, Kowalski. At least one other. The smaller man made a decision. He went through the door. The large man held for 2 more seconds, looking at the dogs, looking at Lydia, and then he went too. She heard the corridor erupt. Not violence, the sound of Walker's people executing a containment, the sharp authoritative voices of soldiers doing their job, the specific acoustic signature of a situation being brought under control by people who knew what controlled looked like. She didn't move from the center of the room. Nero didn't move from his position in front of her. The formation the dogs held was unchanged. Then Walker's voice from just outside the door, "Carter, we have them," she breathed. Nero turned and looked at her, the same direct, measuring look he'd been giving her since she first walked into this room, the one that had no anxiety in it and no demand, just the complete and specific attention of an animal that had made a decision about a person and was not interested in revisiting it. She put her hand on his head. Her hand was shaking. She noticed this and did not feel anything about it, except that it was accurate. It was appropriate for her hand to be shaking, given the circumstances, and she was not going to perform steadiness she didn't have. "Good boy," she said. Her voice came out slightly rougher than she intended. "Good boy." The door opened. Walker stepped in, and he looked at her, and then at the dogs with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. In the time she'd known him, something cracked open in it. Not wide, not dramatic. Just a small, involuntary fracture in the professional surface. He looked at 5 military working dogs arranged in a protective formation around a woman in blue nursing scrubs, and he didn't say anything for a moment. "The team at the gate is in custody," he said finally. Bale called it the documentation they presented as authentication errors that he flagged on inspection. It was good work, but not good enough. "What about the 2 inside?" "Secure. One of them is talking already." A pause. "The case they brought Bale wants it secured as evidence. He's flagged it as potentially containing restricted modification equipment." "It is," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "Pharaoh is 40 minutes out. When she gets here, we're going to do this formally. All of it. You, me, Bale. The documentation you transferred, and those 2 individuals in custody." His voice was steady and calm, and underneath it something was burning that she recognized as righteous anger. The kind that came from a person who'd been deceived by people who should not have been in the business of deception. "It's going to be a long morning." "Yes," she said. "Are you all right?" She thought about giving him the clean answer. Then she thought about the fact that he'd called her by her first name for the first time just now, and that he'd asked the question like he was actually asking it, not performing concern. "Not completely," she said. "But I'm functional," he nodded. That was apparently the right answer, not fine. Not a performance of invulnerability, just an honest operational assessment of a person who was still standing and still able to do what the next few hours needed. He stepped back toward the door. "I'm going to get you water, and something that passes for food in this building at 5 in the morning. Stay with them." She almost said I wasn't going anywhere, but stopped herself, because it was a thing people said, a performance of resolve that was also a deflection. The truth was simpler. She stayed because the dogs needed her present. She stayed because the alternative was waiting alone in a corridor while everything moved around her. She stayed because Nero was still standing near her left side, and Gravel was awake and pressed against the wall near the door, and Rook was watching the corridor entrance with his ears up. And they were doing their jobs. The jobs they'd been built for and then broken by, and then somehow improbably, stubbornly continued to do anyway. She sat down on the floor. The dogs settled around her in their formation, not relaxed, not fully, but present and steady and held together by something that was not training and not command, and not anything that the people who designed the program had intended to create when they brought her in. Outside in the corridor, she heard Walker's radio crackle. Then a voice she didn't recognize, professional, measured, carrying the particular authority of someone making an announcement rather than a request. She heard him say, "Colonel Pharaoh is not 40 minutes out. She's here," and she brought someone with her. Walker went quiet. A beat. Then who? The answer came through clearly enough that she heard it from inside the containment room, and when she heard it, she looked up at the ceiling for a moment with the specific expression of someone whose calculation of a situation has just been fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The name the voice said was not Pharaoh's, it was not Bale's. It was not anyone connected to JAG Corps or Defense Intelligence. It was the name of the man who had run the Black Ridge program from its inception, and he was inside Harbor Ridge Military Hospital. The name was Harlan Voss. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 3 years, but she'd thought it often enough that it had worn a groove, the specific kind of mental scar that formed when you spent long enough being afraid of something without being able to confront it directly. Harlan Voss, Director of Strategic Asset Development at the Kelmar Institute. Harlan Voss, who had shaken her hand on her first day and told her the program was going to change how the military thought about K9 trauma recovery. Harlan Voss, who had signed the administrative separation order with her name on it, and then she was nearly certain, though she'd never been able to prove it, made 3 phone calls in the following week that ensured she would have no official record left to return to. He was inside the building. She stood up. The movement was deliberate, and she made herself take 2 seconds before she went to the door, because 2 seconds was what she needed to ensure her face was going to do what she needed it to do, which was give nothing away. Walker was in the corridor when she came through the door. He was looking down the hallway toward the elevator bank, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not tactical assessment, not controlled fury. Something closer to genuine uncertainty, which on Walker's face was almost disorienting. "Tell me about Harlan Voss," he said. "He ran Black Ridge's K9 program from the beginning," she said. "Civilian contractor, but with DoD-embedded clearances that gave him access equivalent to a senior officer. He built the program's operational framework. He recruited the specialists, controlled the data, managed the relationship with the Arties group." She kept her voice even. "He is also the person who filed the administrative separation that removed me from the official record. He's here with Pharaoh. Willingly? That's what I don't know." Walker's jaw tightened. "He came through the main entrance 20 minutes ago. Pharaoh apparently met him in the parking lot they came in together. She's in my conference room. He's with her." A beat. He presented credentials, Senior Deed Oversight, Inspector General's office. "That's new," she said. "How new?" He didn't have Inspector General credentials 3 years ago. He had contractor clearances, she thought fast. If he has IG credentials now, someone elevated him. Or he built paperwork that says someone did. "Bale is checking the credentials right now," Walker said. "I've got the 2 contractors from the corridor in separate rooms, and Kowalski has the equipment case in a secured space. Pharaoh is waiting for me." He looked at her. "She wants you in the room." "With Voss." Yes, she thought about that for a moment. Voss being here, presenting credentials, requesting her presence, it was not the action of a man who'd come to surrender. It was the action of a man who believed he still had a hand worth playing. The question was what the hand was, and whether she could see it before he played it. "All right," she said. "Carter." Walker stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Brief. Professional, released immediately. You don't have to say anything you don't want to say in that room. Pharaoh is JAG. She's on our side of this. If Voss starts something you're not ready for, you stop and you tell me." She looked at him. He meant it. It wasn't a performance of reassurance. It was a practical offer from a man who'd spent the last 12 hours recalibrating everything he'd thought he understood about the situation in his facility and had arrived at a position of specific operational protectiveness about the woman at the center of it. "Thank you," she said, and she meant that too. The conference room on sublevel 1 was a utilitarian space, a long table, 8 chairs, a wall-mounted desk that was currently off, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. Colonel Diane Pharaoh was sitting at the near end of the table when Lydia came in. She was 60-something, trim, with silver-white hair cut short, and the expression of a woman who had been a lawyer in the military for 30 years and had long since stopped being surprised by anything. Harlan Voss was at the far end. She hadn't seen him since March 2022, and 3 years had done to him what they did to everyone: thinned him slightly, added texture to his face, shifted the specific quality of his confidence from expansive to concentrated. He was 61, with the manicured presentation of a man who cared about how competence looked from outside: good suit, expensive watch, posture that communicated authority without effort. His hair was the same gray it had been. His eyes were the same particular shade of pale that she had learned, over 14 months of working for him, could look warm or cold depending entirely on what he needed from the person he was looking at. Right now they were looking at her, and they were neither. They were assessing Lydia, he said, as if they'd seen each other recently. As if the word itself were a normalizing gesture that might flatten the distance between her reality and whatever version of events he'd constructed to bring himself into this room. "Mr. Voss," she said. She sat down. She put her hands on the table where they could be seen, and she looked at him directly. Farrow spoke first. For the record, Colonel Diane Farrow, Judge Advocate General's Court. Commander Walker, Major Bale, I want this documented from the beginning. She nodded at Walker, who had taken a position near the door. Mr. Voss presented himself to me approximately 30 minutes ago, claiming to have information material to the situation at this facility. He requested to be present for the initial interview. I agreed with the understanding that his status here is voluntary and that this conversation is not a formal proceeding. She looked at Lydia. Ms. Carter, you are not compelled to answer any question in this room. You may stop at any time. Understood, Lydia said. Voss folded his hands on the table. It was a gesture she recognized. He used it when he wanted to look more reasonable than the situation warranted. I'm not here to cause difficulty, he said. I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about what the program was and what we were trying to accomplish. Nobody said anything. The recovery work, the behavioral specialist work, it was always ethically designed, he said. I understand there were concerns raised internally, and I understand those concerns were not handled well. That's something I've thought about. He looked at Lydia. The way your separation was processed was wrong. I know that. That's part of why I'm here. She watched him. He was good. He had always been good. The tone was calibrated perfectly, enough contrition to suggest accountability, not enough to constitute an admission, and framed entirely around the least serious element of what had happened. The ablation system, she said. The team you sent here tonight. The neuromodulation equipment, in the case they were carrying. Walk me through how that fits into an ethically designed program. A pause, barely perceptible. The asset recovery team was operating under a separate authorization that I was not personally directing, but Artie's group holds the authorization. Artie's group is a contractor. They receive operational directives through... You're on Artie's group's board, she said. You and a man named Philip Soren, who also held a senior position at Kelmar. I have the Delaware Incorporation documents. The room was very quiet. Farrow was writing something on the pad in front of her, with the focused attention of a person who has just heard exactly what she came here to hear. Voss looked at Lydia, and the assessment in his eyes sharpened. He was revising his model of the situation. She could see it happening, the realization that she had not spent 3 years simply hiding. She had spent 3 years documenting. Whatever you think you have, he said, and his voice had shifted not dramatically, but the warmth was gone from it. The performing reasonableness quality replaced by something more direct. You should understand the classification framework that surrounds this program. Material removed from a classified environment without authorization is what? Bale said from the corner of the room. He hadn't spoken since she'd come in, and the silence had made her almost forget he was there. He moved forward now, and he set a folder on the table. Because I've been spending the last hour with the documents Ms. Carter transferred to me, and I've also been running the credentials you presented at the front entrance through our verification system. He opened the folder. Your Inspector General credentials are fraudulent. The IG designation number you're carrying corresponds to an officer who retired in 2021 and never held a field appointment. He placed a printed sheet on the table. That's a federal offense, Mr. Voss. You committed it this morning, in a military facility in front of a JAG officer. Voss looked at the sheet. He looked at it for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds something happened in his face that she had never seen happen there before. The construction, the professional, confident, adaptable presentation that he'd been maintaining since she walked in developed a fracture. It wasn't collapse. He was too experienced for collapse. But it was the first visible evidence that the ground beneath him was not what he'd believed it was when he walked through the door. I want to call my attorney, he said. That's your right, Farrow said. She made another note. We'll pause this conversation while you do that. Commander Walker will ensure you have access to a private line. She looked at Walker. And I want the 2 contractors currently in custody formally processed. I also want the equipment case inventoried and photographed in place, with Bale and myself present before anyone opens it. Walker nodded and moved to the door, and things began to happen with the specific efficiency of institutional process when it has finally caught up with what it should have caught up with earlier. Voss was still looking at the sheet Bale had placed in front of him. He had not reached for it. His hands were still folded on the table, but the quality of it had changed. It was no longer a deliberate gesture. It was what happened when a person needed to do something with their hands and hadn't decided yet what the right thing was. Lydia stood up. She looked at him across the length of the table, this man who had shaken her hand and told her she was doing important work, and then erased her from every record he could reach, and she felt something that she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not anger, which had been present for 3 years, and was still present but not prominently. Something quieter and more complicated. She felt the specific weight of being seen lift, not vindication that was still ahead, in whatever process Pharaoh and Baal were going to run. But this particular moment, in this particular room, where the documentation she'd carried for 3 years had just done in 15 minutes what 3 years of hiding had not been able to do, that had its own quality that she didn't have a clean word for. She left the room without speaking to him again. There was nothing left to say to him that wasn't better said in formal testimony, on the record, with Pharaoh writing it down. The morning moved fast after that. Pharaoh ran the contractor interviews and sequenced the large man, whose name turned out to be Derek Mullen, former private security, and the smaller one, whose name was Gus Ferrante, and who had indeed started talking first and hadn't stopped. Ferrante had operational documentation on his personal phone, encrypted but not encrypted well enough for Bale's people, containing communications between Artie's group's field coordinator and a handler at the Phoenix office that laid out the recovery operations timeline, objectives, and the specific instructions about the ablation equipment. The instruction was explicit: complete the memory modification protocol before any legal intervention could be initiated. If legal intervention appeared imminent, secure the animals by whatever means necessary and transport them to an undisclosed secondary facility. Whatever means necessary. The phrase sat in the documentation like a stone. Bale's people were on site by 9 in the morning, 3 additional DI analysts, 2 of whom immediately began working through the documents Lydia had transferred and the physical evidence from the case. The case contained the neuromodulation equipment, exactly as she'd described, a field-modified ablation system, originally designed for legitimate therapeutic use in veterinary neurology, modified with additional targeting components that had no therapeutic application. She explained the modifications to Bale's analyst, with the clinical precision of someone who had spent months studying the original protocol and then several years thinking about what it meant. The analyst, a young woman named Reyes, who wrote very fast and asked very good questions, looked up from her notes at one point and said, "How long were you with the program before you understood what you were actually doing?" 4 months to understand it, Lydia said. 2 more to document it. 2 weeks to get the dogs out of the active phase. 3 days to disappear. She paused. It took longer than it should have to understand it because the early recovery work was genuine. They needed real rehabilitation specialists because the conditioning damaged the dogs enough that they needed real care between cycles. It was easier to deceive us that way, give us work that was actually helpful, so we didn't look too hard at what made the work necessary. Reyes wrote that down verbatim. At 10:43, Voss's attorney arrived, a man named Caldwell, who had driven from Scottsdale in a car that cost more than Lydia's annual salary, and who entered the facility with the professional composure of someone accustomed to arriving in difficult situations and making them manageable. She saw him briefly in the corridor outside the conference room. He looked at her once with the specific assessing gaze of a legal professional clocking a witness, and she looked back without expression, and then Walker moved between them with the body language of a man, ensuring that a corridor remained a corridor and not a conversation. She went back to the dogs. She needed to. Practically, Vasquez was running midday checks, and Nero's suture site needed monitoring, but she also needed it in the way that wasn't entirely practical. The containment room was the one space in the facility where the noise of the morning's institutional machinery was muffled into something manageable, where the work was simple and clear, and the results were immediately visible. Nero's suture site was healing cleanly. The inflammation from the previous day had reduced. He stood for his examination with his usual stoic cooperation, and when she finished, he turned and pressed his nose briefly against her hand, and then walked to his position near the wall and lay down with the economy of an animal that trusted its environment. She stayed with them through the midday hours. Vasquez came and went. Kowalski appeared once to tell her that Pharaoh wanted her formal testimony at 2 o'clock, which she acknowledged. A medic she didn't know brought lunch, a sandwich, and a bottle of water, placed just inside the containment corridor door with the impersonal practicality of a facility in crisis management mode. She ate it, sitting on the floor with Gravel's head in her lap, and Rook watching the door. At 1:15, Walker came. He sat down on the floor across from her, which surprised her enough that she looked at him twice. He was not a floor-sitting man by natural disposition. He was a desk and a straight-back chair man, an upright-in-every-sense man. But he sat down, and he didn't say anything immediately, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. "Bale's people found the parent company structure," he said finally. Kelmar and Ardas both trace back to a holding entity called Northwatch Capital. Northwatch has DoD consulting contracts going back to 2016. The program wasn't a rogue operation, it was funded through legitimate procurement channels that nobody was examining closely enough because the K9 behavioral work was classified at a level that limited oversight. He was quiet for a moment. That means somebody above Voss signed off on the classification level. Somebody with enough institutional weight to ensure the right people didn't look at the wrong things. Yes, she said. Pharaoh's going to pull that thread. She should. He looked at the dogs. How long did you know this was bigger than Voss? Since about month 6 of the program, she said. The classification level was the tell. A civilian contractor running a canine rehabilitation pilot doesn't get that classification. That level of institutional protection requires sponsorship from somewhere inside the system that has actual authority. She shifted slightly. I didn't know who. I still don't know specifically. But Pharaoh and Bale have the documentation now, and they have the corporate structure, and that's going to point toward something. It already has, Walker said. He looked at her with the direct, careful expression he used when he was delivering information he wanted her to receive accurately. Northwatch Capital has a sitting board member who is a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense. His name is James Alroy. He left government service in 2020, went straight onto the Northwatch board. A pause. Bale recognized the name. She absorbed that Alroy. She hadn't known the name 3 years ago, but the shape of it, a former senior official with the institutional relationships and the residual clearance access to enable exactly the kind of program protection she'd encountered, fit the gap in her understanding precisely. Is Bale going after him, she asked. Carefully, Walker said. Carefully and correctly, because Alroy still has people who respect him in the right places, and this needs to be handled in a way that doesn't give anyone a procedural escape route. He looked at her. That's going to take time. Months, probably. It won't be resolved this morning. I know, she said. What gets resolved this morning is Voss, the contractors, the equipment, and the immediate situation at this facility. He looked at the dogs again, and what happens to them. She hadn't let herself think about that directly yet. The dogs' immediate safety, the prevention of the ablation protocol, the removal of the people who had come to implement it that she'd been focused on. The question of what came after was something she'd been holding at arm's length because it was larger than the immediate crisis. They can't go back into a classified program, she said. Not without genuine independent oversight, not in the current environment. Whatever happens with Alroy and Northwatch, these 5 animals spent 3 years being used as experimental subjects, and it's not something that gets fixed by transferring them to a different classification. I know, Walker said. I've already talked to Pharaoh about it. She's going to file for an immediate custody, hold the dogs stay at this facility, under my direct supervision, pending the full investigation. Nobody moves them without JAGI authorization and DIA sign-off. He paused. That's going to take a while to resolve permanently, but it means they're safe while it does. She nodded. Safe wasn't perfect. Safe wasn't the clean resolution that the situation deserved. But safe was real, and real was what she had to work with. Carter, his voice shifted slightly less operational, more personal. Pharaoh is going to clear your administrative record today. Whatever Voss filed to separate you from the program, the separation order, the non-compliance designation, all of it, she has the authority to vacate it, and she will. Your real record, your actual qualifications and work history gets reinstated. A pause. That means you can stop being Lydia Carter, floor nurse if you want. You can be whoever you actually are. She thought about that. About the 14 months of building an ordinary life out of careful pieces, the unremarkable competence she'd turned into a shield, the genuine work she'd done on the 3rd floor that she hadn't expected to matter to her and did. She thought about Walker at 5 in the morning, handing her coffee without asking if she wanted it and sitting on a floor that was beneath his usual dignity because she was sitting on it. I am Lydia Carter, she said. That's a real name. I just also have a real history now. Something in him relaxed slightly. Not much, but enough fair, he said. He stood up. She stood up with him. Nero tracked the movement with his ears, decided it wasn't significant, and put his head back down. 2 o'clock, Walker said. Pharaoh's office upstairs. You ready? Yes, she said. She was not entirely ready. She was functional and clear-headed, and in possession of everything she needed to give the testimony that Pharaoh required, and the part of her that had been trained to assess her own operational status honestly was telling her that functional and clear-headed was going to have to be sufficient, because entirely ready was not a state she was going to reach in the next 45 minutes. That was accurate. She went with it. The testimony took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Farrow was precise and thorough, in the way of someone who understood that what was said in this room was going to form the evidentiary backbone of proceedings that might take years to fully unfold. She asked questions in layers: the surface layer first, establishing the factual chronology, then the second layer that established context and motive, then the third layer that connected specific actions to specific decision-makers. Lydia answered all of it. She answered it carefully and specifically, and she did not elaborate beyond what was asked, because the shape of the documentation she'd provided was already the elaboration. Bale was present for the second half. He asked 2 questions, both of which had the quality of a chess player, placing a piece in a position he'd been building toward for several moves. The first, in your assessment, was the behavioral modification protocol applied to these dogs under conditions that met the DoD ethical review standards that were submitted with the program's original authorization. No, she said. The submitted review described a therapeutic rehabilitation protocol. What was actually implemented was a multi-phase conditioning and modification program with no therapeutic endpoint. The ethics documentation was fraudulent. He wrote it down. One more. The dog's response to your presence, the trust anchor you described being built into their behavioral architecture. In your professional assessment, does that anchor constitute evidence that the dogs were exposed to the specific protocol you documented? She looked at him. Yes, she said. A dog trained under standard military working dog protocols does not develop that kind of response pattern to a single handler contact point. The behavior is specific to the Kelmar conditioning protocol. Their response to me is documentation. Bale nodded once, wrote something, and closed his folder. After the testimony, Farrow walked her to the corridor and handed her a single printed sheet. Administrative separation order vacated, she said. Your record at the Kelmar Institute is restored with a notation of wrongful termination. Your credentials as a behavioral specialist are currently under reinstatement review. That's a process. It takes about 30 days. But the outcome isn't in question given what we have. She looked at Lydia with the particular steadiness of a woman who had seen many situations and calibrated her investment in each one very precisely. You did the right thing 3 years ago and again today. Lydia took the paper. She looked at it. It took a long time, she said. It usually does, Farrow said without apology, because she was a woman who dealt in what was true rather than what was comfortable. That doesn't make the outcome less real. She went back to the dogs. At 6 that evening, Walker found her in the containment room again. She'd been there most of the afternoon. Between the testimony and the documentation reviews and the administrative processing that Farrow's staff was moving through with impressive speed, the dogs were settled. Nero had graduated from watchful alertness to something approaching genuine rest, and the quality of his breathing had the deep, slow rhythm she associated with animals who had moved from crisis into the first stages of actual recovery. Voss is being transported to a federal holding facility in Tucson tonight, Walker said. He was standing near the door, arms crossed, carrying the specific tiredness of someone who had run on professional discipline for 18 hours and was approaching the end of the distance it could take him. His attorney made 3 calls trying to find a procedural argument and came up empty. The fraudulent credentials are clean. There's no way to argue around a forged IG designation. A pause. Mullen and Ferrante are already processed. Ferrante is cooperating fully in exchange for consideration. Mullen is not. But it doesn't matter, Ferrante had enough. And Oren, she asked, processed separately. I recommended consideration for the fact that he was deceived about what he was actually enabling. That's Farrow's call, not mine. He looked at the dogs. Bale is running the Alroy connection from his end. He says it's going to take time, but he's confident in the direction. I know, she said. It's going to take as long as it takes. Walker nodded. He looked at her with the tiredness, and something else underneath it, the same thing that had been present in the floor sitting and the coffee, and the "Are you all right?" that he'd asked before he knew the answer might be not completely. Go home, he said. Sleep somewhere that isn't a cot. Come back in the morning. A pause that had its own specific weight. You still work here. She looked at him. I still work here. 3rd floor, you're on the schedule for 7 a.m., unless you have somewhere else to be. She didn't. She had her apartment and a quiet that was going to feel different than it had yesterday. And she had the knowledge that her real name was real again, and her real history was on paper rather than buried. And she had 14 months of work on a hospital floor that she had built into something genuine without planning to. 7 a.m., she said. He nodded. He started to leave. Walker, he stopped. She looked at him. Thank you. For this morning. All of it. He held her gaze for a moment. You walked into that room alone, he said. I just kept the door open. He left. She sat with the dogs as the facility settled into its evening rhythm around her. The shift change sounds above, the ventilation cycling down to its overnight tone. The particular quality of quiet that sub-level 2 had developed over the course of the day that was different from the morning's held breath tension. Nero lifted his head and looked at her. She looked back at him. Something that had been held at maximum extension for 3 years, the constant alertness, the managed exposure, the daily discipline of being only as much as the cover story required began, very slightly and very carefully, to release. She sat with it. She let it be imprecise and incomplete and not yet resolved. Because it was, and she was tired enough that anything else would have been a performance she didn't have the energy for. Then her phone buzzed, not the facility device. Her actual phone, the one that had received 3 messages from an unknown number across the span of a very long day. The number she'd deleted twice and thought about all afternoon without having the time or the clear ground to address it. The message was longer than the others. Voss is handled. But Voss was never the top of it. Alroy knows you testified today. He was briefed within an hour. Whoever Bale has running the investigation, tell them to check Alroy's communications with someone named Renner. DOD acquisitions currently active. Renner's the one who built the classification shield. If he knows the investigation is moving, he will move first. You have less time than Bale thinks. She stared at the message. Then she called Walker. He answered on the second ring, and she could hear from the background sound that he was still in the building, and she was glad because what she was about to tell him was not a conversation for a phone call to a parking lot. I need you back down here, she said now. A beat of silence. What happened? She looked at the message. She looked at the name it contained. She thought about Bale and his careful, correct, methodical investigation, and the gap between careful and correct and fast enough. We have a problem, she said, that Bale doesn't know about yet. Walker was back in the sublevel in 4 minutes. She showed him the message without preamble, handed him the phone, watched him read it, watched his face do the thing it did when new information intersected with what he already knew, and the intersection was worse than either piece alone. He read it twice. He handed the phone back. Renner, he said. You know the name? Not personally. But DOD acquisitions with classification authority at that level, there aren't many people who fit that description and are currently active. He was already moving toward the corridor. I need to get Bale on the phone right now. The message says Alroy was briefed within an hour of my testimony. That was hours ago. I know. He stopped and looked at her. Who is sending you these messages? She'd been thinking about that all day. The number, the timing, the quality of the information specific, accurate, inside enough to know things that weren't visible from outside the program. Someone who was in the program, she said. On the Kelmar side, there were 3 of us on the recovery team. I disappeared. I don't know what happened to the other 2. One of them is watching your back. Apparently. Can you reach them? Not without knowing who it is, she said. And I'm not going to try to find out, because if they wanted me to know, they would have told me. They're taking a risk sending these. I'm not going to make it bigger. Walker absorbed that and moved on because he was a man who could absorb things and move on in rapid sequence when the situation required it. He got Bale on the phone in the corridor. She could hear the conversation through the open door. Walker's voice low and direct. Bale's responses clipped and precise. The name Renner landed in the conversation, and she heard Bale go quiet for 3 seconds, which was longer than Bale usually went quiet. Then Bale's voice, clearly enough to carry. How did she get that name? Does it matter right now, Walker said. A pause. No, but it matters later. Another pause. Get Pharaoh back in the building. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Walker came back to the doorway. Pharaoh is 20 minutes out. Bale is coming back. He looked at her with the specific directness he'd been calibrating all day. The name Renner appears in 2 of the documents you transferred. Buried acquisitions authorization, 1 line each. Bale's people flagged them but hadn't elevated it yet, because they were working through the documents in sequence. Renner signed the classification authorization, she said. I saw it when I was pulling the files. I didn't know who he was, then the name meant nothing to me. It was a signature on bureaucratic paperwork. It means something now. Yes. She looked at the dogs. Nero was awake, watching the doorway, tracking the changed energy in the corridor, with his ears forward and his body still. The particular quality of alert that was not alarm, but was not rest either. He was reading the situation the way he'd been reading situations his whole life, and his read was that something was still unresolved. He wasn't wrong. Pharaoh arrived first, 22 minutes later, with the look of a woman who had been in her car when she got the call and had driven back with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the situation she'd left was not yet the situation she'd thought it was. She took the message, read it, and said to Bale when he arrived 3 minutes after her, "Renner." "I know," Bale said. "How actionable is what we have on him?" "The 2 document signatures connect him to the classification authorization." "That's a thread, not a case." Bale set his bag on the conference room table. They'd moved back there. All 4 of them, the dogs locked in their room with Kowalski stationed outside. But if he moves to interfere with this investigation, if he tries to pull classification authority to block document access, or makes contact with Voss's attorney, or attempts to flag this case through IG channels that he has relationships in, that becomes obstruction. And obstruction is a case. "So we need to catch him moving," Farrow said. "We need to be ready when he does." Bale looked at Lydia. "The person sending you these messages. They said Alroy was briefed within an hour. How would they know that?" "They're inside," she said. "Or they have a source inside. Inside Alroy's operation? Or Northwatch? Or both?" She looked at him steadily. "I told you, I'm not going to compromise whoever this is. I'm not asking you to." His expression was direct and not unkind. "I'm asking because if they have access at that level, they may have access to information we need before Renner moves. Is there a way to communicate back?" She thought about it. The messages had come in one direction, only no number she could call, no address she could reply to. But the person sending them had been tracking the situation in real time, which meant they had eyes on what was happening here. And if they had eyes on what was happening here, they probably knew she'd received the message and passed it up the chain. "If they want to send more, they will," she said. "I can't accelerate it." Bale nodded. He opened his bag and extracted his laptop and a portable drive and began working with the focused, unhurried pace of someone who had learned that urgency and speed were not the same thing, and that confusing them was how mistakes got made. Farrow made 3 calls in the corridor. Walker sat across from Lydia at the conference table and didn't speak, which was one of his more useful qualities. At 9:47 at night, her phone buzzed. Everyone in the room looked at it simultaneously. Renner made contact with IG office at 1830. Filed a classification review request on the Harbor Ridge documentation, trying to pull it under national security exemption before Bale can use it. The request is sitting with a deputy named Hollis at the IG. Hollis will approve it by 600 tomorrow, unless someone above his level stops it. You have 8 hours. She read it aloud. Farrow was already on her phone before the last word was out. Bale looked at the ceiling for 1 second, a brief, involuntary gesture of someone recalibrating a timeline. Then he looked at Walker. "I need a secure line to my director." Not his office. His personal cell. "Use mine," Walker said, and handed over his facility phone without hesitation. The room became a different kind of busy, not chaotic, not rushed, but the specific, focused energy of people who understood exactly what they had and exactly how long they had to use it. Farrow's call was to a general she'd worked with for 20 years, who had the right relationships at the IG to ensure that Hollis's desk was not the last stop for Renner's classification review request. Bale's call to his director was shorter than she expected, and more direct. She caught the phrase Northwatch Capital, Alroy, active interference, and then Bale turned slightly away from the table and she stopped trying to hear it. Walker looked at her. "This is going to work," he said. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But the alternative is that we spent today doing all of this for nothing, and I'm not willing to accept that yet." It was not reassurance. It was the statement of a man choosing to operate on the basis of the best available outcome, while acknowledging the other possibilities existed. She understood it and respected it more than actual reassurance would have warranted. She went back to the dogs at 11. She sat with them because there was nothing useful she could do in the conference room, and because Nero had been watching the door since 8 o'clock with the patient, unwavering attention of an animal that had decided not to sleep until the person he was tracking came back to him. When she walked in, he stood up, walked to her, and pressed his shoulder against her leg, with the full weight of a 93-pound dog, making a deliberate decision about where to put himself. She sat down. He sat beside her. The others adjusted around them like water finding its level. "I know," she told him. "I know it's not over yet." He put his chin on her knee, and she left it there. And the room was quiet in the way that rooms were quiet when the living things in them had decided to rest, even if they couldn't fully sleep. The classification review request was blocked at 2:41 in the morning. Farrow told her by text a single line, factual, the kind of message that delivered significant information in the fewest possible words, because significant information didn't require decoration. Lydia read it on the cot in the handler rest area, and then lay back and stared at the ceiling for a few minutes and let the specific shape of what it meant settle. Renner's move had been blocked. The documentation was protected. Bale had what he needed. What came after that was going to be slow and procedural and infuriating in the particular way that institutional accountability was always infuriating, incomplete, incremental, moving at the speed of systems that were designed for stability rather than justice. She knew that. She'd known it since she was 28 years old, and tried to report a classified program through its own oversight structure, and learned exactly what that structure was built to protect. But blocked was real. Protected was real. She slept. The weeks that followed were not clean. She had learned by then that nothing was, and she was not waiting for clean, she was waiting for true, and true arrived in installments that she received in between 12-hour nursing shifts and formal interviews, and the daily work of the containment wing, which had become as much her domain as the third floor in the weeks since the crisis. Renner was placed on administrative leave 8 days after the blocked review. The announcement came through official channels, bland, procedural language about an ongoing compliance review, but Bill sent her a message the same afternoon that said simply, "He knows it's coming. He's cooperating. Alroy is next." She read it standing in the hospital parking lot on her lunch break, with the Arizona sun doing what Arizona sun did in the early weeks after the world had shifted, which was shine with complete indifference to the significance of what was happening underneath it. Alroy's situation took longer, 3 weeks, then 5, then 7, and she stopped tracking the specific timeline because tracking it was beginning to consume attention she needed for other things, and because Bale had told her clearly that her testimony was documented and complete, and the next phase of the process did not require her daily investment. It required the people whose job it was to run federal investigations to do their job. She let herself believe them. Voss was formally indicted on 6 counts. The fraudulent credentials charge was the cleanest and the first, but the substantive counts involved the program documentation she'd transferred, and Ferrante's cooperation testimony, and the paper trail that Bale's analysts had spent 3 weeks reconstructing from the corporate structure of Northwatch and Kelmar and Ardis. She heard about the indictment on a Tuesday morning from Walker, who came to the 3rd floor during his rounds, something he'd started doing. She noticed about 2 weeks into the new normal, and told her in the hallway outside the medication station, with the particular brevity of a man who understood that the news was significant, but that she'd also been doing her job for 4 hours already, and would continue to do her job after he told her, and the telling didn't need to be theatrical. 6 counts, he said. Good, she said. Arraignment is next month. Farrow's JAG team is cooperating with the federal prosecutor. Good, she said again. He looked at her for a moment. That's it? Good? She thought about what else there was to say. About Voss's face across the conference room table, the moment his carefully maintained professional structure had developed that first small fracture. About the fact that she'd worked for him for 14 months without understanding what the work was, which was not something she'd fully forgiven herself for, even though she knew intellectually that it was not her fault. About the 3 years of careful disappearance that had been the only option available to her, and that she did not regret, and also would never fully stop grieving, the way you grieved time that had been taken from you, even when you understood why it had to go. It's enough, she said instead. For right now, it's enough. Walker nodded. He left. She went back to work. The dog's formal custody status was resolved 43 days after the incident. Farrow filed the motion, and the court granted it on a Thursday afternoon. And the outcome was everything she'd argued for, in the testimony that felt like it had happened in another life. The 5 K9s were removed from the Black Ridge program's asset registry. Their classified unit designation was transferred to a newly established ethical working dog recovery program, operating under direct military oversight with independent veterinary and behavioral review, and their care protocol was rewritten from the ground up, based on the documentation she'd provided and the additional standards that Vasquez, who had become, over the course of 6 weeks, someone Lydia would have called a colleague and was beginning to think of as a friend, had developed in collaboration with 2 external veterinary behaviorists. The program didn't have an official name yet. That was still being processed through channels. But Walker called it the K9 Recovery Initiative in conversation, and Lydia noticed that the name had begun to appear in interdepartment communications without quotation marks, which meant it had achieved the specific kind of informal institutional existence that preceded official existence. She was appointed as the program's civilian behavioral specialist. The appointment was formal. Pharaoh's office processed the reinstatement of her Kelmar credentials and the concurrent appointment to the new role with the same meticulous documentation that Pharaoh's office applied to everything, but the way she found out about it was Walker dropping a copy of the paperwork on the nurse's station counter on a Wednesday morning while she was updating patient charts, without ceremony, with the specific understatement of a man who'd decided the thing mattered, without needing the moment around it to confirm that. She picked up the paperwork. She read it. She set it down. "You could have told me ahead of time," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I wanted to see your face when you read it instead." She looked at him. He was not quite smiling. He was doing the thing he did instead of smiling, which was a very slight relaxation of the jaw that most people would miss entirely. She'd learned to read it. "Thank you," she said. "Pharaoh's paperwork," he said. "Thank her. I will." She picked up the appointment document again. She looked at her name on it, her actual name, Lydia Carter, and beneath it the credential designation and the role title and the facility name in full, Harbor Ridge Military Hospital, Phoenix, Arizona, and she felt the particular weight of a thing being true when it had spent a long time being buried. The way objects brought up from depth had pressure in them that took time to release. James Alroy was indicted 11 weeks after the incident, on a morning she spent in the containment wing, watching Nero run an obstacle course that Vasquez had designed for his rehabilitation. Nothing tactical, nothing that would pull on his training history, just movement and problem solving, and the particular joy that working dogs found in using their bodies for something that had a point. He cleared the last obstacle and came to her at a dead run, and she caught his momentum with both hands, and he shoved his face into her chest, and she held on and let herself feel, without managing it, the specific quality of that moment. Then her phone buzzed, and she saw Bale's message, and she stood in the containment wing with a mud-pawed Belgian Malinois leaning against her legs and read about Alroy's indictment on 3 counts including obstruction and program authorization fraud, and she breathed. The breath was not relief exactly. It was something more complicated than relief, the particular feeling of a long thing concluding, the release of a sustained note that had been held so long you'd stopped hearing it as sound and started experiencing it as pressure. And when it finally ended, the silence was strange and large and took some getting used to. She called Bale. "Is it done?" she said. "This part," he said. "The legal process takes as long as it takes. But the exposure is complete. Everyone who needs to be named is named. Everyone who needs to have charges filed against them has charges filed." A pause. "The program is shut down. Not suspended, shut down. The DOD issued the closure order this morning, same time as Alroy's indictment. Northwatch Capital lost 3 federal contracts in the last hour. Kelmar's remaining operations are under review." His voice had the particular quality of controlled satisfaction, not triumph. Nothing so simple as that. The specific feeling of a professional who has done a difficult thing correctly. "You did this, Carter. The documentation you preserved, the testimony, the names you provided, all of it. It took 3 years," she said. "Yes," he said. "It did." She thought about that. About 28-year-old Lydia Carter in a program she believed in, working with animals she cared about, slowly understanding that the thing she was part of was not what she'd been told it was. About the decision to document. About the decision to try the right channels first, and the education that followed in what the right channels were actually built to protect. About the person who had helped her disappear, she'd never learned who, and she still didn't know. And the 3 years of building a small, careful life that was real, even though it was also fiction. About the 14 months of ordinary nursing work, that she had not intended to be meaningful, and that had become so regardless. Because that was what happened when you did genuine work for long enough. It acquired meaning that wasn't contingent on the circumstances that brought you to it. "Bale," she said. "Yeah, the other 2 specialists. The others from the Kelmar recovery team." She'd been thinking about them on and off for weeks, the unnamed source who'd sent her the messages, and whoever else was out there. We found them both," he said. "They're okay. Neither of them disappeared, the way you did. One of them was administratively reassigned into a different program, and apparently spent 3 years trying to figure out how to report what they knew without becoming a target, and the other one is a veterinary behaviorist in private practice in Colorado, who has been maintaining a documentation archive of her own." A pause. "We've been in contact. Their material corroborates yours on every significant point." She closed her eyes for 1 second. "Good," she said. "That's good. The one in Colorado sent me something yesterday," Bale said. "She said to tell you that she's sorry it took this long, that she should have reached out earlier, and she was afraid." "Tell her I understand that," Lydia said. "I was afraid too." She meant it without self-reproach, because self-reproach was not what the situation warranted, and because the woman in Colorado who'd spent 3 years maintaining her own archive in a private practice in a state Lydia had never been to had made. Exactly the decision Lydia would have understood making. Fear was not the opposite of courage. It was the thing courage had to move through to get where it was going. The formal recognition ceremony was Walker's idea, though he would have described it differently. What he actually said, 6 weeks after Alroy's indictment, was, "Farrow wants to do something official. I told her it's your call." What she said was, "What does official mean?" What he said was, "Documented acknowledgement of your contribution to the investigation. On the record. Formal." What she did not say but thought was that 3 years ago, she would have wanted to avoid a room full of people looking at her with official recognition and the particular exposure that came with it. She would have wanted the outcome without the visibility. What she said was, okay, the ceremony was not large. Farrow's office, a Tuesday afternoon, a room with chairs arranged in 2 rows, and a small group of people who represented the various threads of what the past months had been. Walker, Kowalski, Vasquez, Bale, 2 of Bale's analysts, the hospital's commanding officer, who had been briefed gradually and thoroughly on everything that had happened in his facility. The veterinary behaviorist from Colorado, whose name was Sandra Okafor, had driven down and was sitting in the second row with her hands in her lap, and the expression of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was still adjusting to the absence of its weight. The other former Kelmar specialist, the one who'd been reassigned, whose name was Marcus Webb, and who turned out to be the source of the messages, which she'd suspected, and Bale had confirmed 2 weeks ago, and which she'd acknowledged to Webb in a single phone call that had lasted 11 minutes and covered more ground than conversations 3 times. As Long usually managed was not there in person. He'd sent a message that Bale read aloud at the beginning, which was brief and direct and said, "In the middle of it, she tried to do the right thing, when the right thing was the most dangerous option. That's not a small thing. That's the only thing." Farrow read the formal acknowledgement from a document that existed now in the official record that named Lydia Carter as a civilian behavioral specialist whose preserved documentation and testimony had been instrumental in exposing a classified program operating in violation of DoD ethical standards, resulting in the shutdown of the program and the indictment of 3 individuals, including a former senior DoD official. Lydia sat in the front row and listened to her name, read back to her in official language, and felt the strange doubling of it, the person described in the document, and the person sitting in the chair were the same person, which should have been obvious, but which felt newly obvious, in a way that had no clean explanation, except that for 3 years they had not been obviously the same person, and the closing of that gap had a specific quality that she was going to need more time to understand. Afterward, Sandra Okafor found her near the window and said, "I should have done what you did 3 years ago." "You didn't have what I had," Lydia said. "I'd already built the archive before I understood what they'd do when they realized I had it. You didn't get that lead time." "I had enough," Sandra said. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with the directness of someone who'd learned that directness was kinder than its alternatives. "I made a practical choice and told myself it was the only choice." "There's a difference." "Yes," Lydia said, "there is." Sandra looked at her. "Does it feel the way you thought it would?" Lydia considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. "No," she said. "I thought it would feel finished. It feels more like something that's been running in the background for a long time finally closed. Like the absence of something rather than the presence of something." "That's exactly what it is," Sandra said. They stood at the window for a moment. Outside, Phoenix was doing what Phoenix did, heat and light, and the particular blue of the sky at that altitude. Enormous and impersonal and indifferent to what was happening in any building beneath it. It was beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when you had enough space to actually see them. Walker came to find her 20 minutes later, when the room had mostly cleared. He had 2 cups of coffee facility coffee, the bad kind, which she had stopped noticing months ago because bad coffee consumed daily, long enough ceased to register as bad, and became simply the baseline of what coffee was. He handed her one. She took it. "How are you?" he asked. "Better than this morning," she said. "Better than yesterday." "That's a trajectory," he said. "It is." They stood near the window with their bad coffee, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had been through something together and no longer needed to fill the space between them with words that were performing a connection rather than having one. "The program's first intake is next month," he said. 3 dogs from a unit coming off deployment. Standard PTSD presentation hypervigilance. handler avoidance, sleep disruption. Vasquez has the medical side covered. I know. She sent me the files yesterday. And we can help them. She said it, without qualification, without the hedge of I think or probably or the cautious language she'd been using for months to protect herself from making promises she wasn't sure the situation would allow her to keep. We can help them. He looked at her. The jaw relaxation was there again, the thing he did instead of smiling. Good, he said. She went to the containment wing after everyone left. It was evening by then, the facility settling into its overnight rhythm, the light through the corridor windows carrying that late quality that made everything look briefly important. The dogs were awake when she came in. All 5 of them. They tracked her from the moment she came through the door, with the particular attention they always gave her. Not anxious, not demanding, just present. Just the specific and complete form of awareness that animals gave to the things that mattered to them. Nero came to her first. He always did. He stood in front of her and looked up at her with his dark eyes, and she looked back at him. And between them, there was something that didn't have a name in any language she knew, and that she'd stopped trying to name. She sat down on the floor. All 5 dogs arranged themselves around her, not the protective formation of the crisis, not the wary alertness of their worst days, but something looser and simpler. Gravel put his chin on her knee. Rook pressed against her left side. The 2 Dutch shepherds settled close enough that she could feel their warmth. Nero lay down in front of her and put his head on his paws and watched her face with the steady attention of an animal that had decided where it belonged and was not interested in any argument to the contrary. She thought about what Walker had said the morning after the incident you walked into that room alone, and she thought about all the things that sentence contained and didn't contain. She had walked in alone. Yes, but she had also not been alone in any of the ways that ultimately mattered, because 3 years of preserved documentation was not the work of someone alone. It was the work of someone who refused to let the things she knew become invisible just because the system wanted them to be. And Webb sending messages from somewhere he couldn't name, watching a situation he couldn't enter, doing the only thing he could do with the access he had. And Sandra Okafor in Colorado maintaining her own archive for 3 years with no idea if anyone would ever need it. And Vasquez, who had looked at Lydia from the first day with the particular attention of someone who was seeing more than the surface presentation, and had decided to let the surface presentation be whatever it needed to be until the moment came to see through it. She had not done this alone, and the dogs, these 5 animals who had been through things that would have broken simpler beings, who had been used as instruments by people who looked at them and saw only their utility, who had come through the conditioning and the modification attempts and the relentless reduction of their personhood to asset value. They had not done it alone either. They had done it with each other. 5 dogs, coherent as a unit, maintaining something between them that no protocol had been able to ablate because it was not a trained response. It was a genuine bond, the kind that formed when living things went through difficulty together and came out the other side still recognizably themselves. That was the thing that the program had never understood. You could modify behavior. You could shape responses. You could build in triggers and anchors and conditioning cycles. But you could not manufacture loyalty. You could not engineer the specific quality of what existed between Nero and the other 4 dogs, or between any of them and her, because that quality was not a product of what you did to living things. It was a product of what you did with them, what you built alongside them, what you showed up for repeatedly in the ordinary, unglamorous accumulation of daily presence. The program had used her to build a trust anchor, without knowing that in doing so they were building something they could not control, because real trust was by definition not controllable by anyone other than the beings who shared it. She had spent 3 years being afraid of that, and also quietly being proud of it. She looked at Nero. He looked at her. "We're okay," she told him. It was what she'd told him in the first days, when his breathing was wrong and his leg was inflamed, and the acute crisis of the morning was still present in everything in the room, in his body, in the 6 hours of chaos she'd walked into. She'd said it then because it was the thing she needed him to hear, the thing that might reach the part of him that was still reachable when everything else was noise. She said it now because it was true. He blinked at her. It was a slow, deliberate blink, the kind that dogs did when they were calm, when the person in front of them was not a threat and not a demand, but simply a presence they'd decided to trust. A blink that said, in whatever language dogs said things, I know we are. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, the Phoenix night was doing what it did the sky, going from orange to deep blue to something approaching black at its edges, the city lights beginning to define themselves against the darkening sky, the enormous indifferent beauty of a desert evening that asked nothing from anyone beneath it. Lydia Carter, behavioral specialist, former invisible person, woman who had spent 3 years being only as much as she was permitted to be, and who had nonetheless preserved what needed to be preserved, and shown up when it mattered, and refused through all of it to let what she knew become lost, just because it was inconvenient to the people who held power over whether she existed, sat on the floor of a military medical facility with 5 dogs around her, who had survived the same years she had survived, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt real. That was the thing about being seen after a long time of not being seen. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like the return of something that should never have been taken, the restoration of a name and a history and a set of skills and a professional identity that had always belonged to her, and that she had spent 3 years carrying in hiding, rather than allow them to be erased by people who had the institutional authority to erase things, but not the right to erase this particular thing. She had not been broken. She had been patient. And eventually, because she had been patient, the truth had arrived at the place where it could be heard. That was the lesson she couldn't put into a training document or a formal testimony or an official record. It lived in the space between what she'd been told she was too civilian, too soft, too outside the military framework to matter in a tactical situation, and what she'd actually been all along. Not a hero, not a soldier, not something that required a special designation to validate its worth. Just a person who knew something true and refused to stop knowing it. The dogs breathed around her in the long, slow rhythms of animals at rest. Nero's eyes had closed, finally. His chest rose and fell with the reliable regularity of something that had decided after everything to sleep. She stayed until the overnight staff came on. She stayed until the facility's evening sounds had settled into their quieter register, and the corridor outside the containment wing was empty, and the only light was the low operational lighting that the sublevel ran on overnight. Then she stood, and the dogs shifted around her, and she said goodnight to each of them quietly, without self-consciousness, the way you spoke to living things you'd decided to take seriously, and she went through the door. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor. She walked her floor the familiar route, the rooms she knew, the particular sleep sounds of a ward at 11 at night, the small steady rhythms of an institution that kept doing its work regardless of what happened inside or outside it. She picked up a chart. She made a note. She checked an IV line that had needed checking since the afternoon. She was a nurse. She was a behavioral specialist. She was a woman with a real name and a real history, and a facility full of people and animals who needed her presence. And that was not a small thing. That was the whole thing. That was everything that mattered when you removed all the layers of authority and title and institutional weight that people used to measure whether a person's contribution was worth acknowledging. Worth was not a sign from outside. That was the thing. It never had been. She had spent 3 years invisible, and the work she'd done during those 3 years had been the same work she would have done, visible, careful, precise, driven by the conviction that the true thing was worth preserving, even when no one was watching her preserve it. No one had given her that conviction. No one could take it away. In the morning, she would go back to the dogs, and the morning after that, and the one after that, for as long as they needed what she had to give them, which she expected would be a long time, and which she did not resent. There was a program to build. There were intake protocols to design and behavioral assessments to develop, and a whole architecture of ethical practice to construct from the ground up, piece by piece, the way good things were always constructed, slowly, imperfectly, with the specific patience of people who understood that the work mattered more than the credit. She finished the IV check. She replaced the chart. She stood in the hallway of the 3rd floor of Harbor Ridge Military Hospital at 11:15 at night and breathed in the recycled air of an institution that was at its best trying to help people, and she felt it the specific, uncomplicated, ordinary weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She went to write her notes. She had a lot to document.